History is full of amazing stories and memorable people.
But we don't care about them.
No hits, deep tracks only.
Some of the most influential people in the world have been completely overlooked or just plain forgotten.
We're digging deep into the history books to bring you their stories.
I'm Phil.
And I'm Matt.
We're not historians. We're just two guys who enjoy a great story and plenty of laughs.
This is History's B-Side. Today's B-Sider is Lincoln's Bodyguard.
Peeling back the curtain here a little bit, we don't normally do this, but we're actually recording 2 episodes back to back, which is not something we've really done too much before, but we both had episodes prepared on the same night, so we figured we would try to knock 2 out at once. But we're recording this one on the same night that we did Matt's great Champenois episode, which was last week's. And I really hope everyone appreciated that episode. If you haven't listened to it yet, please go back and listen to it, because it's definitely something that Matt is knowledgeable and passionate about. So I think it really was one of our better episodes. But we have been enjoying champagne for the last, 2 hours, because it was a pretty long episode. So this one should hopefully be kind of fun. And it's kind of relevant to the topic that we have been drinking a little bit while doing this episode, because our topic for today is someone who was not the best at his job, and that included some drinking while on the clock, which is going to play into the big part of today's story. So it's kind of appropriate that we've had a few drinks and we're enjoying our evening while we're recording this one.
Yeah. Drinking on the job. Cheers.
Cheers. So speaking of drinking on the job and, maybe not being the best employee, we have talked on our podcast before about some of the jobs that we've held, both currently and in the past. Have you ever had just a really terrible coworker for whatever reason? Don't mention any names. We obviously don't want to call people out.
No, of course.
Just anyone that comes to mind that was a really, really not great person to work with.
I don't know that I would use the term terrible, because all of the people that come to mind had wonderful qualities a lot of the time. Many
You're such
of
a
my
hippie liberal.
I mean, I do. That's not just being like compassionate and hippy dippy. The people who immediately popped into my mind are people I genuinely like, and I think partially did a really good job sometimes. Most of my experience with that came as a manager at Youngstown's Pressed Coffee Bar and Eatery. And yeah, I mean, I definitely had my fair share of people who were less pleasurable to work with and less pleasurable to train and manage.
Well, you mentioned training. I mean, that's something I've done a lot in my career, I guess. I mean, when I worked at Panera, and we've talked about that, I did a lot of training. I trained a lot of our new employees on the food preparation and pretty much all of the stations that we did there. And there's just some people that pick it up immediately to the point where I feel like I'm wasting my time by trying to train them and go through step by step. And then there's people that just seem like no matter what you do, they're never going to learn.
Yep. Yeah, that's kind of how I felt training baristas, especially. In fact, we were just talking about this the other day at my current job at the wine shop, but there's something about coffee, and it's true in the wine industry too, I suppose, but specifically coffee, because you actually have to make something. So there's a technique, right, to be followed. There's a recipe to be followed, and baristas who would come from other coffee shops, for whatever reason, specifically Starbucks, who were very difficult to train because they had their own idea of how things should be done and believed very strongly that's how they should be done. So there were several instances of training somebody to make a certain recipe or make a drink a certain way, where you teach them and then weeks later find out they were just making it their own way, which, to an individual employee might not seem like an issue. Like, I like making the drink this way, so I make good drinks. Great. But when somebody comes into a business, they expect consistency, right? They don't want to order a mocha on a Monday and have it be drastically different from their Tuesday mocha and their Wednesday mocha. So it definitely, that attitude of like, I know how to do this better is one of the worst qualities to train out of people, regardless of how right they may be.
I mean, we get that a lot in like a restaurant too, is people that make cocktails or whatever, like they make it a certain way, or I mean, in some instances you actually like servers and bartenders who don't have experience before they come in, because you can kind of train them the way that you want them to be. Which, I mean, it's great to have experienced people, but like you said, a lot of people come in with biases about how the way they've done things in the past, and that's not necessarily always the best thing.
Right. And sometimes to even, I don't know, press harder on the hippy dippy pedal, it doesn't even have to be a bad trait necessarily, but like, I'm just considering myself. Like, if I went to another restaurant, like, for instance, say if I went to like a really formal restaurant, like the French Laundry in Napa, I think I would be really weird at first, because I'm used to serving and talking with guests at a, you know, very well stocked, very well run, but ultimately fairly casual wine bar, at least in our approach to customer service, where like at a more formal restaurant, I think I might be a little bit too casual with guests, just naturally from, you know, being used to having those more intimate conversations. So it's not always a negative thing just on the employee, but it's definitely true that past work experience isn't always the best thing.
Well, moving past the training aspect of it, because that's really not even necessarily the point that we're trying to approach with today's B-Sider, but some of the things that are not necessarily training or even employee performance related, but just kind of maybe an attitude or an approach toward your work, or things like showing up late to work or doing things while you're working that you maybe shouldn't be doing. I mean, I've definitely had employees that we've worked with who, no matter what, could not show up on time to work. They would always be 10, 15 minutes late, or sometimes much longer. Or, I mean, I'm not going to say that I was always the perfect employee. There were definitely days working at Panera where I had to be there at 7 a.m. and I got a phone call at 7:30 because I wasn't there, and it woke me up and I had to hurry up and get to work on time. But
sure, but that's,
you know what I mean? Like there's always those people who make it a habit of being late to work, and they're not very reliable for that instance.
Well, that's the thing. If it's an accident once or twice or even a couple times, it's not a big deal. But I've known people that are consistently late. Yeah. And it's almost more irritating. About. Yeah, I'd prefer an employee who was like accidentally late to the tune of an hour a couple times over somebody who's consistently 5 minutes late, only because I know after a while you have to know you're getting there late. And to continue to do so means you chose. Like you could do things about that. You could start your day 5 minutes earlier. You could get in the shower 5 minutes earlier to get ready for work and be there on time. So it is frustrating when somebody's consistently just late, because that's a choice instead of something out of their control.
And then probably the big one that we're going to talk about, and maybe we're guilty of it right now, but we're running our own podcast and not working for the man, you know, is drinking on the job.
Yeah.
And I mean, okay, I work in a bar, so it happens.
Same.
I've seen employees do it. I'm not going to throw anyone under the bus for it, but you know, it's pretty common in a lot of like divey type bars where people can kind of get away with that, but working in a more formal setting or place that has a little more structure, it's typically not something you're allowed to do. And especially if it's a like a job that isn't a job that serves alcohol, you really probably shouldn't be drinking when you're going to work.
That's pretty extreme. Yeah, I will say I encountered a lot more of that working in the wine industry than the coffee industry, thankfully. I mean, not a lot of people were like using flasks at 6 a.m. at a coffee bar, but Yeah, there's been a handful of people I've worked with here and there that, you know, abused the freedom I think they had in their job, especially the proximity to alcohol. And that can get really frustrating because, it's a responsibility I think we all hold to be able to serve this without abusing it and causing it to affect our work performance.
So we're obviously both speaking from a position where we work in the service industry. So we are around alcohol while we're at work. And it's not necessarily allowed, but it's a part of the job at times. Can you think of any jobs that it would be very bad to have an employee like this who's often late to work or not fulfilling the duties of the job or potentially drinking while they're working? What sticks
Airline
out
pilots.
That's a good one.
All three of those would be
dangerous.
terrible. Like either the flight's delayed because he's late, or I don't know, the plane's going down because he's doing his job poorly or drunk. That's not something I ever want. I suppose an Uber driver too. Like, I don't want my Uber driver trashed.
I mean, my thought was like a teacher, but that's maybe not necessarily dangerous as it is like just bad for molding young minds.
That's fair. I mean, that is super fair. I wouldn't want my kid's teacher to be plastered, but I'd rather her be drunk than my pilot.
I guess we can jump right to the point here and say that one of those jobs that would be bad for someone to be not very good at their job or late or drinking on the job or whatever would be a police officer or some type of security. In particular, maybe a member of the Secret Service, where your job is to protect some very important people.
Yeah, no, that wouldn't be ideal.
So I'm gonna test your knowledge here now that we're gonna get into it.
Oh, great.
How much do you know about the Secret Service? Do you know
Not a lot.
what the
Not a
Secret
lot,
Service was originally established to do?
I mean, I would assume provide security for the president and his family. But I also feel like this feels like a trick question. So, I don't know. I mean, I'm going to stick with that, but I feel like I'm wrong.
Well, yes, you are obviously wrong because the Secret Service was established to suppress counterfeit currency. So, by the end of the Civil War, nearly 1/3 of all currency in circulation was counterfeit. Some
Interesting.
people actually estimate that amount to be almost half of all currency was counterfeit.
Wow.
It's pretty crazy. It's hard to imagine a country surviving when half of
you'd
their
think that
currency is counterfeit.
You'd think that would majorly screw with the value of the note, right? Like,
Yeah, it really wouldn't be worth too much if people are passing the counterfeit bills.
at 50% of the currency in rotation, like that's crazy.
So, as you can tell by the episode title today, we are talking about Abraham Lincoln. And Lincoln was actually the one who established a commission to focus on this problem of counterfeit currency. And while he didn't live to see its eventual creation, on July 5th, 1865, the Secret Service was established to help address the country's financial stability. So they were the ones who were going to focus really in on the counterfeit currency problem. At this point, there weren't many federal law enforcement agencies. They really only included the U.S. Customs Service, the U.S. Park Police, the U.S. Postal Inspection Service, and the U.S. Marshal Service. But even the Marshal Service didn't really have the manpower to investigate all crime that was under federal jurisdiction. So they eventually brought in the Secret Service to begin investigating crimes such as murder, bank robberies, illegal gambling, and bootlegging.
So would the Secret Service investigate these types of crimes alongside police officers or separate from police officers, but at the same time?
I don't necessarily know the answer to that. My guess is that we have pretty clear definitions of federal crimes versus state or local jurisdiction.
Gotcha. Okay.
So if it pertain to a federal crime, it would eventually fall to the U.S. Marshals or the Secret Service. But
Okay.
probably a lot of these issues were just handled by the local police departments or the whoever was the local authorities.
Sure.
If they were federal crimes, which probably at this time would include things like bootlegging and gambling, that probably would fall to the Secret Service, would eventually take care of these issues.
Gotcha.
All this type of law enforcement would eventually become the responsibility of the FBI, but that didn't exist until 1908. And even today, the Secret Service still oversees things like crimes against the financial and banking sector, cyber crimes, and can you name it?
Crimes against the financial banking sector, cyber crimes, and terrorism would be my third guess.
You had it right at the beginning of the episode. Protecting the president is their main objective.
Dang it. See, it's a bait and switch. You threw me off.
Yeah, I'm just tripping you up here. So following the assassination of President William McKinley in 1901, Congress requested that the Secret Service would begin providing presidential protection. And today they're known for protecting the president, the vice president, the first family, visiting foreign heads of states, major presidential and vice presidential candidates. So typically as we get closer to the general election, once we have the actual party nominees established, they'll be able to get some type of Secret Service protection. And you still have a little bit of Secret Service detail with former presidents, not necessarily as much as when they were the acting president, but the Secret Service is a pretty large agency today. They're actually under the Department of Homeland Security now, so they have a much larger presence than they did when they were first established, and they are able to protect all sorts of people underneath that umbrella. They also coordinate security for national special security events, such as political party conventions, major speeches, and of course, the Super Bowl.
I didn't know that, but honestly, I'm not surprised that the Super Bowl is like in their sights.
I mean, it makes sense. It's like a huge national event, and you have so many people that are present for the actual event, but also in the city where it's taking place, and people traveling to and from the event. It actually has a huge impact on the country, and whether or not you care about football, if something happened at the Super Bowl, it would be a national emergency.
That's really interesting, honestly. Like, I mean, I obviously don't want to see that happen, but like, it's crazy that like something happened at the Super Bowl, the Secret Service would be like on it.
Maybe it's something that's better thought about for like a sci-fi film or some type of fiction than actual happening in reality. So obviously Lincoln set the building blocks to establish the Secret Service, but not for the specific purpose of protecting the president. And since we're talking about specifically Lincoln's security, we should probably talk about why he needed security himself. And a lot of that falls into a man that's pretty well known by the name of John Wilkes Booth. How much do you know about John Wilkes Booth?
I know that he assassinated President Lincoln, and that's about it. I assume he was a Confederate, either member of the Confederacy or a Confederate sympathizer, but that's just, I don't know, context clues.
Yeah, so John Wilkes Booth was a pretty famous actor at the time. He was from Bel Air, Maryland. He was also a Confederate sympathizer, which is a pretty nice way of saying that he was very much pro-slavery, which is against the number one pinnacle of the History's B-Side podcast, which is slavery is bad.
Slavery is bad.
We're going to repeat that as long as this podcast is still being published to your local podcast service. Slavery is bad. The Booths, at least the Booth family, were very well known in the theater business. They were a family of actors pretty much centered around the Baltimore area. John Wilkes Booth separated himself from the rest of the family by performing under the name of J.B. Wilkes. It was kind of a way for him to separate himself and just make sure that he was recognized for his own talent rather than just being a member of the Booth family. Sure. Audiences really loved his heightened enthusiasm, and some critics actually called him the handsomest man in America and a natural genius.
Wow. A natural genius.
Booth was also very outspoken in his hatred of Lincoln when he became president. He was actually arrested on stage in St. Louis when he said he, quote, wished the president and the whole damned government would go to hell. He was charged with making treasonous remarks against the government, but was released after paying a fine and taking an oath of allegiance to the Union.
Honestly, this surprises me. In today's environment, I don't know. I'm surprised this wasn't objected to on a First Amendment basis. Was this like, I don't know, were laws different at the time? Was the First Amendment not as aggressively defended, or was this just a product of Union concern about the Confederacy?
You know, I actually thought about this when I read that, and I actually thought about who is the comedian Kathy Griffin that held up the like bloody mask of Trump or something like that.
Yeah.
And she really faced a lot of backlash for that, and Trump is obviously a very unpopular president compared to, well, I guess Lincoln was probably pretty unpopular in his time with half the country as well.
Sure.
But it might just be that we are in a much more modern, progressive society that allows more criticism of the president than maybe they were in 1864, 1865. So, I don't know. I mean, she faced some backlash because of the things that she said against the sitting president, whereas Booth just saying that he wished the president and the government would go to hell got him arrested. You know what I mean? It was just very different perception of people's criticism of the president at the time.
Gotcha.
After Lincoln was reelected in 1864, Booth, along with co-conspirators David Harold, George Atzerodt, and Lewis Powell, made plans to kidnap the president.
Honestly, I feel like kidnapping the president would be a worse plan than just killing him outright. Like, then you have to deal with it, and people can find him and know where he is instead of just one and done.
Yeah, I don't know what the end goal was necessarily. I mean, they're obviously Confederate apologists, so they're hoping for this to be a way for the Confederacy to take control of the entire nation, but
Gotcha.
I don't necessarily see what kidnapping the president really does unless you're holding him for ransom to install a Confederate leader.
Right.
But once Booth learned about the surrender of Robert E. Lee on April 12th, 1865, Booth decided the plot to kidnap Lincoln was no longer feasible. He told his friends that he was done acting and that the only play he wanted to present was Venice Preserved, which was an old English tragedy centered around an assassination plot. So clearly a small hint to what he had in mind.
Yeah.
On the morning of April 14th, while collecting his mail at Ford's Theater, Booth learned that the President and Mrs. Lincoln were planning to attend the play Our American Cousin at the theater that evening. He immediately set about planning to assassinate the president that same day. He also worked in his co-conspirators. Powell would assassinate Secretary of State William Seward, Atzerodt would assassinate Vice President Andrew Johnson, and Harold would help them escape to Virginia. Booth believed that by killing the Union leaders and successors, it would enable the Confederacy to reorganize and regain power. His position as a well-known actor allowed him easy access throughout the Ford's Theater to carry out his plot. And though Booth was successful in killing the president, his co-conspirators were not. Seward survived a stabbing attempt by Powell. Atzerodt got drunk and never made an attempt on Andrew Johnson's life.
Nailed it. That's great.
Booth was tracked down and killed 11 days following the assassination. So we know what happened with John Wilkes Booth. He clearly was able to carry out his plot to kill the president. But I guess what we're here to talk about today is more about the guy who kind of enabled John Wilkes Booth to go about with this plan. And though it wasn't necessarily successful in the end, he did still kill the president, which is a pretty big moment in American history.
Yeah.
So we're going to talk about the man who really was a bad employee for his job and kind of led to the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. We're going to take a short break and then we'll get into his story here.
So our listeners are pretty used to hearing us talk about what we're drinking on the episodes that we record. And usually it's beer, wine, or some sort of spirit. Sometimes that has to do with the B-sider of the day. But today I'm just drinking a cup of coffee. And to be honest with you, Phil, it's the single worst cup of coffee I think I've made for myself in several years.
Oh no, is it truck stop coffee? Because I've had a lot of experience drinking truck stop coffee recently.
Honestly, I don't know how I did it, but this might be worse than truck stop coffee. It doesn't have the metallic taste, but it's definitely it's on par with a terrible gas station cup of coffee.
That sounds disgusting.
It's delightful.
Maybe you should buy some coffee, or someone should buy you coffee.
You know what? I like that second option a little bit better. And it works out because we're here today to tell our listeners about a new listener support service we're using called Buy Me a Coffee. And you can find us and buy us a coffee at buymeacoffee.com/historiesbside.
And it's cool because there's a couple different ways that our listeners can get involved and support the show. Number one, you could just donate to the show by clicking Buy Them a Coffee.
2, you can join as a member with levels starting at $5 per month. A few of the membership perks include monthly bonus episode titled History's B-Side Battles, in which we debate to see which B-sider would come on top in a battle royale to the death. You also get access to our future episode queue, discounts on extras on our online shop, and History's B-Side gifts and swag.
And those extras, like you mentioned, include things like choosing topics for future episodes. You can buy custom postcard sets or stickers, and we even have some things like coffee mugs or some future merch that we're going to add on there as we go. And you obviously don't have to be a member to get those things, but if you are a member, you get a discount on them, and it's actually a much better deal, 25 to 50% off what you would if you weren't a member.
It's a great way for our listeners to support us in a more casual way and make sure that we're not recording while drinking terrible cups of coffee like the one I have in my hand right now.
The website again is buymeacoffee.com/historiesbside. We so appreciate your support. It's what helps us continue to put these episodes on every single week and continue our research and make sure you're learning about all the cool people from history that we sometimes forget.
With that said, let's get back to today's B-Sider.
All right, so we talked a little bit about what led to Lincoln's assassination, but we didn't really touch on who was maybe supposed to be preventing the assassination. So that's really the focus of today's episode is Lincoln's bodyguard. And on the evening that Lincoln was assassinated, it was a man by the name of John Frederick Parker. He was born on May 19th, 1830 in Winchester, Virginia. His father was a butcher who later became a police officer, but after his father's death, he moved to Washington, D.C., where he worked as a carpenter. He also briefly served in the Army early on during the Civil War.
This might be a dumb question, but I assume that means the Union Army?
Yes,
Okay.
yeah, he was actually fighting for the North. Probably the whole reason that he would have, one day eventually worked for Lincoln.
Sure. That's what I assumed. I just wanted to clarify.
On July 16th, 1855, he married Mary America Mouse, and the two had 3 daughters, Cora, Sally, and Kate.
I love the middle name America. I don't know why.
Very patriotic,
Mary
right?
America Mouse.
When the Washington, D.C. Metropolitan Police Force was established in 1861, Parker became one of the first 150 officers enlisted. While working as a police officer, he faced the police board for 14 disciplinary infractions over the next couple years.
Jesus. Okay.
He was one of those not so great employees that we talked about early on in the episode. Some of those infractions that he was charged with included conduct unbecoming of a police officer, using abusive or insulting language, firing a pistol through a window.
Oh my God. I mean, I guess that's less weird for a cop, but
Well, yeah.
it'd be way weirder for a barista.
He also was charged with sleeping on duty, which this charge was for falling asleep on a streetcar while he should have been walking his beat route. The charge was dismissed when he claimed that he heard ducks squawking on the streetcar, so he boarded it to see what the fuss was about.
I gotta control
Apparently
those city
that was
ducks.
a legitimate excuse.
Yeah.
He was also accused of being drunk on duty and visiting a house of prostitution while he was walking his route. Of course, with this one, he claimed that the madame had sent for him to protect the establishment.
Sure. Of course.
Seems very convenient.
Yeah.
At times he was reprimanded for these misdeeds, but the charges were usually dismissed. He was never actually fired for any of his mistakes as a police officer.
I mean, we definitely don't have to get into like a political conversation, but I feel like that's not an unfamiliar situation for us this year.
I was kind of wondering if you would point that out.
Yeah.
I will say, I think it's a very different situation that he was in versus what police officers are in now.
I agree with that.
I don't think we have police unions, or at least at the time there weren't police unions that protected the officers for maybe breaking protocols.
Yeah.
But in this time, I think police departments were a lot more informal, and it was a lot easier to get away with breaking some strict codes that might be in place.
Right.
Regardless, and in a very unusual situation, on November 3rd of 1864, the Metropolitan Police were formally tasked with guarding the president. And for some reason, Parker was one of the 4 officers selected.
You're like, we need...
Kind of seems like a bad choice for the job.
We need 4 cops to go protect the president. You. The one on his last warning. Let's go to the White House with you.
Maybe they thought it would better suit him since he was obviously not very good at walking his beat route. But some historians do believe that he was a distant relative of Mary Todd Lincoln on her mother's side.
Oh, okay.
This isn't confirmed, but it would potentially explain why he was chosen for a more high-profile role than just being a police officer. Another thing worth noting in this story is that Lincoln was very casual about his own safety. He was, of course, a very polarizing president. He received numerous threats to his life while he was in office. He actually survived an assassination attempt in August of 1864. In this circumstance, there was a soldier who had been tasked with guarding his home and heard a gunshot and went to check on the president. He found President Lincoln without his hat, and when searching the area where the gunshot was heard, they found the hat with a bullet hole through the top.
Oh, wow.
Lincoln didn't think he needed extra security even after the incident. He's actually quoted as saying, "I long ago made up my mind that if anybody wants to kill me, he will do it." So he really wasn't that worried about it.
That's like a very zen approach to your own potential murder.
Still, this incident led to the creation of the 4-person security team that included John Parker.
So I'm curious, who made the call to put this team together if Lincoln himself didn't feel the need for a security team?
I believe it was a congressional decision to create a security team for the president. It's kind of weird that they didn't have one already, considering he was a very important figure for the country.
Right. Okay. Do you, the second part of my question, I guess, is that do you think Lincoln's casual attitude about his safety was partially at fault for his death?
Yeah, I think for sure. I mean, if he was more concerned about people trying to assassinate him, I'm sure he would have wanted a better security team around him. And obviously we know from the A side of history that Lincoln was assassinated in a theater. And it's known that Lincoln went to this theater multiple times without any kind of security detail at all. Yeah. So the fact that he had one on the night that he was assassinated is actually better than probably his normal circumstance. Right. But obviously, spoilers to the ending here.
Yep.
Didn't really help to save his life.
Not quite.
So getting into that story, on April 14th, 1865, John Parker was assigned to accompany the Lincolns to Ford's Theater, with his shift starting at 4 p.m. Naturally, he was 3 hours late and arrived at 7 p.m.
3 hours. After 3 hours, you should just be fired as soon as you show up to your job. I don't care if you're the Secret Service or a Starbucks employee. Like 3 hours late is excessive.
Really sucks for the guy who was replacing, right?
Yeah.
So Parker was told to go to the theater and wait for Lincoln's arrival. The Lincolns planned to attend the play Our American Cousin with Major Henry Rathbone and his fiancée Clara Harris. They actually arrived late to the play and got there about 9 p.m. When they arrived, the actors paused in the middle of the production and the orchestra played Hail to the Chief as the Lincolns took their seats in the box to the right of the stage. Parker was stationed in a chair in the hallway outside of the president's box. From his position, Parker could only hear the play. And going along with Lincoln's casual attitude towards his own safety, it's possible that Lincoln actually dismissed Parker from his post. Or maybe Parker just left his position to move to the first floor where he could actually see the play happening. Regardless, at intermission, Parker left the theater with Lincoln's valet, Charles Forbes, and his coachman, Francis Burke, to go have a drink at the Star Saloon located next door to the theater.
All right. It's going to go drink at intermission while I'm protecting the president. It's fine.
Yeah. I mean, it's intermission. What's going to happen?
I'm surprised they had enough time. Like, intermissions aren't that long. They're only like 10 minutes.
I kind of think that either Lincoln himself or Parker dismissed himself to go be done for the night, go have a drink, and maybe come back when the president leaves the theater.
Yeah.
Ironically, another patron at the bar that evening was famous actor John Wilkes Booth, who was likely building up his liquid courage for his own evening plans. It's not known if Parker ever returned to Ford's Theater that evening. If he did, he probably only went to his spot on the lower level where he could watch the play. Either way, he did not return to his post outside of the president's box. John Wilkes Booth arrived at the theater about 10 p.m., and Booth, knowing the play well, timed his attack with a scene that always induced a loud laughter from the audience, so many present may not have been aware of what actually happened that night. Even if Parker had been at his post, he may not have stopped Booth from entering the president's box. Booth was a well-known actor who Lincoln had seen perform before. It's likely that he would have been allowed to greet the president and pay his respects, completely unimpeded by the guard. One of Parker's fellow presidential bodyguards, a man named William H. Cook, accused Parker of bearing responsibility for the president's death. He's quoted as saying, "Had Booth found a man at the door of the president's box, armed with a Colt's revolver, his alcohol courage might have evaporated. It makes me rather bitter when I remember that the president had said just a few hours before that he knew he could trust all of his guards. And then to think that in that moment of test, one of us should have failed him." Parker knew that he had failed in his duty. He looked like a convicted criminal the next day. He was never the same afterward.
I mean, not so much with the never being the same, but this seems maybe like it's kind of a Jack Phillips situation where multiple people are blaming each other for something that may or may not have been their fault, right?
Yeah, I get that in a sense. I guess maybe the difference is that John Parker was still alive after the incident.
That's fair.
He's the one who kind of had
Yeah,
to
that's
face
true.
the music, whereas
Jack Phillips didn't.
Jack Phillips maybe gets pinned with some of what went wrong on the Titanic, but didn't live to defend himself.
Yeah, that's a good point.
What's really odd is that Parker showed up at the police station the next morning at 6 a.m. with a woman named Lizzie Williams, who he wanted charged with prostitution. She was eventually released without charge, but in my mind, it kind of brings up some speculation about that whole situation.
Maybe he met her at the bar and then just didn't like the way the night ended. That's what I kind of feel like happened.
I mean, yeah, that's kind of where my mind went with it too. I don't want to just say that because I don't think that's necessarily historically accurate, and we are trying to present these people in the factual way.
It's all speculation.
But yeah, but it's really weird because his job was to protect the president that evening, and if he returned to the theater where he was supposed to be, where did he meet this woman?
Right.
And if he stayed at the bar and arrested a woman for prostitution, why wasn't he at the theater? You know? Either way, he wasn't necessarily fulfilling the duties that he was assigned to that evening.
Yeah. The behavior definitely doesn't line up. Even if he actually went back to the theater and then later found this Lizzie woman, like, why were you out looking for, I don't know, prostitution offenders right after the president you were supposed to be protecting was
after
shot?
The guy you were guarding just got killed.
And no matter what, it's a weird incident of human behavior after a traumatic event.
For sure. And I find it very hard to believe that he went and made this arrest for prostitution right after the president was killed.
Right.
You know, like, I guess that's kind of where I'm losing it as far as believing his story that he actually went back to the theater. But again, speculation. We're just reporting what we read from facts and trying to draw conclusions from there.
Exactly.
Parker was charged with neglect of duty on May 1st of 1865. The citation actually read, quote, "In this, that said Parker was detailed to attend and protect the president, Mr. Lincoln, that while the president was at Ford's Theater on the night of the 14th of April last, said Parker allowed a man to enter the president's private box and shoot the president." Parker was tried on May 3rd, but no records or newspaper coverage exists of the trial, and the case was dismissed on June 2nd, and he faced no criminal punishment. It's likely his case was considered unimportant in comparison to the pursuit of John Wilkes Booth and his co-conspirators. Somehow, though, Parker remained a part of the White House security team.
What?
One,
He failed at his most basic job duty.
right, like that's literally his only job is to protect the president, and he didn't do it. And he didn't get fired. Didn't really face any
Jeez.
penalties or punishment for it. One evening, when Mary Todd Lincoln was still living in the White House following her husband's death, Parker was assigned to protect her. Her seamstress, Elizabeth Keckley, overheard Mrs. Lincoln chastise Parker, saying, quote, "So you are on guard tonight, on guard in the White House after helping to murder the president."
Oh, damn. Shots fired. Mary Todd Lincoln coming out with the gloves off.
To this, Parker replied, quote, "Pardon me, but I did not help to murder the president. I could never stoop to murder, much less to the murder of so good and great a man as the president. I did wrong, I admit, and have bitterly repented. I did not believe anyone would try to kill so good a man in such a public place, and the belief made me careless. I was attracted by the play and did not see the assassin enter the box." Mrs. Lincoln always would believe that he was guilty of being an accomplice in the assassination.
What do you think, having done the research? I mean, I personally don't think he was an accomplice, but...
I think it's really hard to say. I don't think he was an accomplice. I don't think he was one of the co-conspirators with John Wilkes Booth and purposely allowed him to enter the box and kill the president. I think he was kind of just, like we said, a guy who was really bad and unfit for his job.
Mm-hmm.
Part of me, as we talked about, with the whole prostitution arrest, makes me think that he never returned to the theater. I think he maybe used I was on the lower level to watch the play as a convenient excuse to say that I was there. I just wasn't in the right place. But based on his track record and the whole arresting a potential prostitute thing, makes it seem like he wasn't there at all.
Just out partying.
So I don't know. Either way, it doesn't make him come out good. Like, he wasn't there to protect the president. But on the same token, if he was there, he might have just let Booth go anyway. And that's not even a knock against him, because almost any guard probably would have, because he was a well-known actor who Lincoln was familiar with. And let's be honest, security was a much more casual approach then than it is today.
I mean, I kind of agree with what you said. I don't think he was, I don't know, like a direct accomplice. I do wonder, like, even if he, like you said, even if he was sitting at his post, if he would have been able to do anything to stop Wilkes Booth. And I think it's a big leap in logic to assume that his possible misplacement that night was a direct cause of Lincoln's assassination. I don't know. It seems like John Wilkes Booth was pretty determined in his cause and would have found a way around one security guard standing outside.
I think it's perfectly fair to charge him with neglect of duty. If that was he was actually on trial for, he clearly did not do his job of protecting the president. And I think you could charge him with that whether he was present in the hallway outside the box or not. And I think it's pretty clear that he wasn't there to protect the president.
Right.
So I think that's a fair charge. And the fact that he got off without any kind of penalty is kind of ridiculous.
Mm-hmm. No, I don't.
But I don't.
I mean,
know
not only did he get off, but he kept his job. He's in the White House the next
Right.
week with the first lady. Like, what is that?
That's like the whole thing. You had one job and you did it wrong.
Yeah, right? Good God.
And he still kept his job. So eventually Parker did return to the Metropolitan Police Force until he was eventually fired on August 13th, 1868 for, again, falling asleep on duty.
My dude has some serious on-the-job narcolepsy. What is with this? Like, I'm somebody that falls asleep in public, as we know, but, like, I've never fallen asleep at work. How? Has it happened to you twice?
For this one, he blamed it on just being sick, but regardless, it didn't save his job at this time. He returned to working as a carpenter, but would eventually die on June 28, 1890 from pneumonia complications. He was buried in an unmarked grave in Glenwood Cemetery in Washington, D.C., along with his wife and 3 children. There are no known photographs of John Parker, which kind of leaves him as a faceless and forgotten character from one of the greatest American tragedies. And I think that's really interesting. Like,
Yeah, he was never
people
photographed.
who see this episode are going to see a picture of John Wilkes Booth assassinating the president as the episode cover, which will be the first episode that we've done that we don't actually have any type of picture of our main topic here.
Yeah, even Cleisthenes had the head bust.
I guess that's not true because Crazy Nancy didn't have one because
That's true.
we don't know anything about her, but she was just kind of a figure to represent all of women bootleggers. This is like a legitimate guy who has a real story, who was a part of American history. I mean,
Yeah.
he clearly was not like a main player in this story, but he was in a position where he could have prevented the assassination of an American president, and he failed in that duty. And all we know about him is his name.
So what do you think? I mean, we're kind of doing this new thing in our episodes where we talk about whether or not this person was a good person morally or a bad person. Do you think he was a bad person?
I wouldn't say he's a good person. I think that's...
Okay. I was going to say, like, maybe that's an easier
sure.
question to answer. Is he a good person first?
I guess...
Because I kind of agree.
It's not necessarily fair to say he's not a good person, because he could be a good person. He's just kind of like a dunce. Like, he just...
Yes, that's the vibe I got.
You know what I mean?
He's just like aloof and oafy and not really with it.
Yeah, like, it doesn't mean he's a bad person necessarily, but he's definitely not like a hero.
Right.
He clearly failed in the one job that he had to do, which was protect the president. And he's not necessarily a bad person. Like, I don't think there was any ill intentions to the fact that he left the theater with 2 of the other president's assistants to go have a drink at the saloon next door.
Right.
But, like, he was on duty. His job was to protect the president, and he didn't do that. So what are you doing, man?
Right.
Like...
I mean, not to supply him with any sort of like benefit of the doubt, but we're also looking back on this situation from a time when we all kind of know the intensity of the Secret Service and how thorough and dedicated to their job they are, even being willing across the board to take a bullet for the president. So not that he did his job well at all. Like, even if he was a restaurant server and did something similar, it would be a bad job. But we can be more critical of him knowing how the Secret Service acts today than back then, when they were this fairly new group of people that even Lincoln didn't think was really necessary. So I don't know if it's a huge stretch to like blame him for just kind of taking the job casually.
Yeah, and the world is just different today. You know, Lincoln is a much more polarizing president than someone like Joe Biden.
Yeah.
Like, clearly in today's world, there's half the country would be against Lincoln, looking for a chance to kill him, and probably in that time too. But no one would have thought that there was a world in which someone would just walk into the theater and kill Lincoln.
Right.
But they did. There was someone who had that access and did it. And there should have been a guard present to prevent that from happening. In today's world, the president is surrounded by security because there's all kinds of lunatics that we're aware of who are going to attempt something like this. And it's just kind of a product of the society that we live in.
Right. All right. Well, do you think you're ready for your quiz?
I have no idea. I'm excited to try it.
I think the questions are fair. I feel good about it.
All right. Let's do it.
We'll be right back.
Establishing connection to Science Night. Executing protocol. Relaunch.
Science. What is it? Who does it? Why does it matter?
The Science Night podcast answers these questions and showcases the latest in science news and discoveries.
Join us every other Friday to meet the scientists behind the science and the stories behind the work. Learn more at scinight.com. That's SCINIGHT.com.
The Science Night podcast is a proud member of the River Power Podcast Mill. Find out more at riverpower.xyz.
All right, welcome back. So as many of you know, we like to end every episode with a short quiz for our host to see what he might have learned during his research, and also to give our listeners a fun chance to test their own historical knowledge. How do you feel today, Phil? You feel good about the quiz? You can hear Barley excited for the quiz in the background.
That's because he knows that we've done 2 episodes back to back here, and he's been sitting while we do like 3.5 hours of recording, so he's ready for us to be done.
He's been very patient. If he drank champagne, I would give him some.
No, I don't know what to expect here. I don't know what you're going to have for me, so
They're not too bad.
I will do my best, but there really wasn't a ton on John Frederick Parker outside of what I already talked about, so I feel like there's going to be around like Lincoln's presidency or something, and I'm going to be honest, there's probably a big gap in my knowledge about Lincoln.
2 of them are about the assassination itself. 1 of them is about the Secret Service. None of them are about John Parker, but that's, I suppose, to be expected. So
we'll see how it goes.
Yeah. So for your first question, and what I think might be the most simple for you to answer, after the assassination, John Wilkes Booth jumped onto the stage and shouted something, a 7-word phrase. What did he shout?
I read it. It's something about a tyrant, but I don't know the exact phrase.
So he shouted, "Sic semper tyrannis, the South is avenged." Sic semper tyrannis in Latin, meaning ever thus to tyrants.
Yes. Yep.
I honestly thought you would. I thought you would get sic semper tyrannis. I didn't know if you would get the last part. This is the South is avenged. I thought maybe you'd.
No, I mean that stuck out to me, and I literally just read it last night, but I don't know the actual Latin phrase.
Sic semper tyrannis. So now for your Secret Service question. So we've talked a bit about the Secret Service and their jurisdiction and job duties. But one of the things the Secret Service currently focuses on, of course, is protecting the president. And part of that are a series of rules that they follow to ensure that happens. And one of those rules is that when traveling, the president is never allowed to be more than 10 minutes from what?
Oh. I have no idea. I feel like the obvious answer would be like a hospital or something, but I don't know if that's geographically possible to be within 10 minutes of a hospital at all times. So, I don't know. What is it?
It apparently is geographically possible to be less than 10 minutes away from not just a hospital, but a trauma center at all times.
Really?
And Secret Service agents also carry bags of the president's own blood in case a transfusion is needed.
So I really kind of got that, didn't I?
Yeah. No, that was great. I thought you'd either go hospital or airport. One of the two.
Oh, yeah, I could see that too. I mean, I can't imagine if the president is in, like, I don't know, the middle of the desert in Arizona. Not that he'd be in the middle of the desert, but even like some remote parts of certain states, you wouldn't be necessarily within 10 minutes of a hospital.
I feel like,
I guess if you have like access to an airplane or a helicopter.
yeah, I feel like either they have access to a
possible.
helicopter, or in, I guess, extreme cases, maybe they just set up their own trauma center.
Yeah, that's true. They probably have easy ways to do that.
Yeah.
A mobile version.
Yeah, I thought that was kind of interesting. For your final question, another question about things that were spoken out loud the night Lincoln was assassinated. You mentioned that there was a point in the play where the actor said something that made the entire audience laugh, and that John Wilkes Booth was familiar with this part in the play. So I looked this up, and the line, which we might not find funny because A, we're not in the context of the play, but also we're not living in the 1860s. But the line is, "Don't know the manners of a good society, eh? Well, I guess I know enough to turn you inside out, old gal, you sockdologizing old man trap." My question for you is, what does sockdologizing mean?
I was just going to say, I'm going to start using that as an insult. But I have no idea what it means.
Sockdologizing old man trap. It's almost on the level of like Shakespearean insults for me.
Yeah,
They're, like,
for sure.
Super ridiculous. So
Sockdologizing. Wait, let me think it through. I say that and I have no idea. Is it like sock actually referencing to what you wear on your foot?
no. So sockdologizing refers to the noun sockdologizer, which is essentially just a decisive blow or remark, specifically in an argument or an outstanding person or thing. So sockdologizing in the context of the play, I think, might mean one who, you know, the sockdologizing old man trap would be one who constantly makes outlandish remarks or ends the argument, if that makes any sort of sense.
I guess.
That was definitely your hardest,
know.
most outlandish question, but I couldn't not include sockdologizing in the thing. So, yeah, I mean...
That will be the official insult of History's B-Side podcast.
You
is
sockdologizing old man trap.
Old fool. Old, what is it?
Man trap.
Man trap.
So that's what caused the laughter that John Wilkes Booth chose to leverage.
That's crazy.
As always, we really thank you all for your continued support and listening in. We hope you enjoy learning about history with us as much as we do learning about it with you. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, just want to chat with us, feel free to email us at historiesbside@gmail.com or reach out on social media.
And you know, if you have any issues with things that we talk about on our podcast, you're just a sockdologizing old man trap. So, you know what? We don't want to hear it.
Thanks for listening.
We'll see you next week.
History's B-Side is an independent, listener-supported podcast.
Leave us a review or subscribe to the show on your favorite podcasting service. And follow along on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at History's B-Side.
Send us your feedback or inquire about sponsorship and advertising opportunities by emailing us at historiesbside@gmail.com.
You can donate to the show at buymeacoffee.com/historiesbside. While you're there, check out our membership perks, merchandise, and more.
This episode was researched and produced by your hosts, Matt Melito
And Phil Hall. Thanks for listening to History's B-Side.